Last week, I mentioned that Joey on Twitter asked if I could rank my top 10 favorite, or in my opinion, the top 10 greatest WrestleMania endings of all time. This was after I had said that I thought the ending to WrestleMania 10 was one of the best, which it is. I saw it as a challenge, and so I went to work. I put together a list of all my favorite WrestleMania endings, which I think it ended up being around 14. 14 of them, maybe 15. So then I whittled that down to 10, and then came the really hard part, which was ranking them. Ranking is always the toughest part, and it is subjective. I always have to mention that. There are no wrong answers here. Unless you have the ending to WrestleMania 27 on your list, then you would be wrong. So here is my list of the 10 greatest WrestleMania endings, starting from the bottom with number 10, and then we'll work our way to the top. Number 10 on my list is WrestleMania 8. Now, WrestleMania 8 always has a special place in my heart. That's one of my favorite WrestleMania shows. Two awesome matches, Randy Savage and Ric Flair for the WWF title, Bret Hart and Roddy Piper for the Intercontinental title. The best match I've ever seen in Piper's career, certainly in WWE. He never had a better match than he did there with Bret Hart. And then came the main event, which was Hulk Hogan in what was billed as being possibly his final match, and it was for about a year, taking on Sid Justice in what was a pretty horrible match. A horrible match with a horrible finish. A mistimed finish. The whole thing was just colossally screwed up by a miscue. Papa Shango was supposed to come out. It wasn't his fault. It's funny because Godfather did a WWE, one of these photo shoot shows, and he told the whole story about exactly what happened. He was waiting and waiting and waiting, and they sent him out there late. He was supposed to break up the pinfall, and he completely missed that, and then ended up coming down to the ring late. So anyway, the whole thing was just, one big just horrible deal there, until, as Hogan was being double teamed by Sid and Papa Shango and tied up in the ropes, all defenseless, we hear the Ultimate Warrior's theme music, and off to the ring comes the Warrior. He just sprints down that long aisle all the way to the ring. And the Hoosier Dome was a big building. I mean, they had 62,000 people there. He sprints down that aisle, running past everybody. All of the extended hands trying to touch the Warrior as he comes down to the ring. Even though he did look like somebody had put the real Ultimate Warrior in the dryer a little too long, he was still in good shape. But that whole scene was just awesome. And I think, again, horrible match finish, but as endings go, even today, when you go back and you watch that crowd going crazy and the guy sprinting down the aisle and he clotheslines Papa Shango out of the ring and Hogan escapes, and now, him and Warrior are basically working together, and this is 2 years after they had their, WrestleMania match. And they were still two of the big, even though Warrior had been fired, and this was his first appearance in like 8 months, he and Hogan were still two of the biggest names, in wrestling, and two of the biggest names in the history of that company. And now they're face-to-face in the middle of the ring. It was a fun ending. It was this electric atmosphere. As a kid, but even now as an adult, going back and watching it, which I did with all of these endings, when I knew I was going to do this list, it's an awesome ending. It really is. It's just this electric, awesome ending. If you can look past, like if you're not a Warrior fan, you're not a Hogan fan, if you could just look at this objectively, that was a hot way to go off the air with a WrestleMania show. And then, of course, they posed, and there was pyro, big celebration, even though Hogan, he won by disqualification. But anyway, I have WrestleMania 8 here at number 10. Number 9 is, and this probably will be higher up on some of your lists, but I have it at number 9, WrestleMania 17. Now, I debated even putting this on my list at all because I hated it when they turned Austin heel. Business-wise, obviously, it turned out to be a bad move, but just judging it from what happened that night, I felt like I couldn't leave this off because it is such a historic moment. You go back and watch it, it does kind of have this epic feel to it. It was like a big deal when this happened. This was a very big thing that happened. And arguably it marked the end of the Attitude Era. Attitude Era as I saw it. I mean, the Attitude Era was defined by Austin versus McMahon, right? There were a lot of other things about the Attitude Era. Rock had his, like the Nation and DX feud, Ministry, Undertaker. There's a lot of things, that you can associate with the Attitude Era, but it was defined by one feud, Austin versus McMahon. And the minute that Stone Cold shook hands with Satan himself, as JR called him on commentary that night, that to me marked the end of that era. And that then led into what we can call the Invasion Era, which then led to the Ruthless Aggression Era in 2002. But it is an epic climax to this show. Austin may have turned, but, they were in Texas. And Stone Cold winning the title in the main event of WrestleMania in Texas is not going to get anything other than massive cheers from the audience, which is what this got, even though it took about 17,000 chair shots and the assist from Vince McMahon to beat The Rock. But listening to Jim Ross, spazzing out on commentary, I was in the hospital when he came out of surgery. I thought I knew him. I thought I knew Stone Cold. And just doing this big heel turn that I think a lot of people never thought they would see to end the show. It is a top 10 Mania finish. But for me, it ranks, among the lowest of the 10 and not the highest. But I felt like I just couldn't leave this off. Number 8, WrestleMania 14. The WrestleMania 14 main event, Shawn Michaels defending the WWF Championship against Stone Cold Steve Austin. This was to be Austin's crowning moment here. This was the passing of the torch. They knew Michaels' back was just completely screwed, and his career possibly could be over. At the very least, he would be out for a very long time. And so this was going to be the crowning of their new anointed top star, even if Michaels at first really didn't want it to be. We've heard the story about Undertaker taping his fists. Undertaker, he did that interview, that off-the-record interview in 2002, before WrestleMania 18. He sat down with Michael Landsberg, and they brought this up, and he actually said, it was going to be a long night for Shawn Michaels if he didn't do the right thing. And in the end, he did. And this was not their best match. They had a few matches before, at least one, like a pay-per-view match, which was at the King of the Ring in 97. And, the last time they wrestled, Austin had not yet been dropped on his head by Owen Hart, and Michaels' back was in a better way, and they had a really good match. But here, you had WrestleMania main event, the championship was on the line, and you had the X Factor here in Mike Tyson, who had joined DX on television weeks before. He was the outside enforcer. He was ringside, and this, again, a very big deal. A lot of press, a lot of media around this, hiring Tyson. I think they paid him, a couple $1 million, was the smartest thing that Vince McMahon could have done. Because that singular event is really, I think, what helped it almost helped resuscitate life back into WWE, at least in the mainstream, because, they had ceded first place for so long to WCW. They needed something like this to help get the attention and the spotlight back on them, and in turn, back on Austin. It was smart from that perspective, too, to do what they did, because that just helped elevate Steve Austin that much more. Now, that might not work today if he tried something, if they had Conor McGregor come in and sort of raise the arm of Roman Reigns, he'd probably get booed out of the building. I don't think that would work now, but, Austin was already over. People loved him. People were, cheering for him everywhere he went. He was already the top star. This just sort of, cemented him in that spot. And you have the iconic call by Jim Ross, when the match is over, the Austin era has begun. The impromptu knockout shot by Tyson on Shawn Michaels after the match was already over. It was a memorable finish that served as the official kickoff to the Austin era. And if you watch Raw the next night, the opening segment when McMahon is presenting the new championship belt to Austin, Austin comes out, the only time he ever came out with that winged eagle. When he comes out that night, it just feels, when he introduces Austin, it really honestly feels not like just another episode. It feels like the start of a brand new era. Like they hit the reset button, and now this is Austin's show, and off to the races they went. So this was a memorable finish. Number 7, WrestleMania 26. WWE had Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker wrestling the year before at WrestleMania 25. And had they positioned that match as the main event the year before this, that for sure would have ended up in my top 10, because that's, to me, the greatest WrestleMania match I've ever seen. And to end the show with a match like that, even if nothing else happened when it was over, that would have been a hell of a way to end that show, but they didn't. It was in the middle of the show. The following year, however, WrestleMania 26, they took their rightful place in the main event. They smartened up and they said, look, anything we put on after this, especially with this stipulation, is going to die a death. So the only spot for this match, even though there's no title on the line, you've got this guy's career against the Streak. That's a big enough stipulation that this is the main event of the show. And you had that added drama. Will Shawn... there were people, I'm sure, who watched that who thought, there's no way that Shawn Michaels is going to lose twice to The Undertaker. He's going to get his win back. Probably newer fans. So there were people who probably thought that Shawn was going to win this match. Oh, his career's not going to be over. He's not that old. Come on. So you had that added drama. Is he going to be the one to break the streak, or is his career going to be over? And these two, they pulled out a lot of their greatest hits from the match the year before, but I love that finish. You have Shawn Michaels struggling to his feet, clawing at The Undertaker, smacks him across the face. This just enrages The Undertaker. He gives him a super jumping tombstone for the win. He didn't just end Shawn's career with a tombstone. He got some height on that thing and drove him headfirst into the mat. That coupled with, they embraced after the match, the show of respect. Undertaker left. He gave him the ring. Shawn is just looking around, this massive crowd in Arizona, just taking it all in. They didn't play his music or anything. And then takes the long walk down the aisle to go off the air. If Michaels and Ric Flair were in the main event of WrestleMania 24 in Orlando, because they did the same thing there, right? Flair's career was on the line. He lost. Didn't play any music. He walked that long aisle and waved goodbye to everybody. Then that would have been on this list too. That would have been a top 10 finish. I mean, you're seeing the retirement of maybe the greatest of all time. You could say the same thing about Shawn Michaels. And he did it in, after an excellent match. I put that match just a shade below their match at WrestleMania 25. But that's also one of the reasons I'd rather not see him come back for some random tag team match. But again, when the money is that strong, you do what you got to do. And look, if he comes back and he's even 75% as good as he was 8 years ago when we last saw him, then we're in for some fun matches. If he returns for more than just a tag team match. But for over 8 years, this guy actually honored the retirement stipulation. So that adds to it too. Knowing that he was one of the few to actually stay retired, even if he does come back now, I just felt like this was the perfect send-off. Number 6, appropriately, is WrestleMania 6. Now, as a kid, I don't know that I could adequately explain to, if you are a younger fan, how big of a deal it was at the time to have Hulk Hogan against the Ultimate Warrior in the main event, champion against champion, title for title, babyface against babyface. You didn't see that back then. And I still remember watching the match live. I still remember, being shocked when Hogan missed the leg drop and disappointed because I fell on the Hogan fence. Everyone had friends who were either a Warrior fan or you were a Hogan fan. All these years later, I have no idea why I had the Warrior wrestling buddy for all those years and not Hogan. But I was always a Hogan fan more than a Warrior fan. So I, like Edge that night, very disappointed by the outcome. But it was an epic match. It really was. And looking back at it now, all these years later, there are people who will probably go back and watch and be like, man, this match was the shits. I can't believe that I used to like this. There's going to be people like that. I go back and I watch it and I think to myself the same thing I thought when I probably watched it 5 or 10 or 15 years ago when I watched it on replay, which is, wow, this match is actually better than it had any right to be. This match was a hell of a lot better than I probably, going in, if I was a little older when I saw it the first time, than I would have expected it to be. There really is nothing wrong with, there's some rest holds and all that, but there really is nothing wrong with the match. They built what I thought was the best possible match that those two guys could have had. They had themselves a really good match. I would not call this the shits. I would not call this horrible. Hogan and Sid, WrestleMania 8, that was a terrible match. Hogan Warrior, WrestleMania 6, was not. And, idea was that it would serve, obviously, as a passing of the torch, which it did, temporarily. It didn't last very long, but, for less than a year. But for that year, it was a passing of the torch. They said, we're going to try to go with the Warrior. It didn't work. And Hogan stole some of the spotlight at the end of the match and kind of made it about him, which is, what Hogan does. But look, I thought the whole thing where he presents Warrior with the championship, there's kind of a little standoff there. What's he going to do? It is funny, though, when the match ends, Earl Hebner, he grabs both belts. I think it was Earl. Was it Earl or Dave? I think it was Earl. He grabs both belts. Warrior only takes the Intercontinental title. He's like, no, don't give me the other one, because he knows Hogan is supposed to get the belt and give it to him. Obviously, nobody clued the referee in about that. Hogan hands the championship over and hugs him, and he raises his arm. And then that visual of Hogan on those old WrestleMania ring cards, which may have been the last time they used them, being taken to the back and just longingly looking back at the ring as the pyro goes off and Warrior celebrates his great victory, at the Sky Dome in front of 68,000 people, was an epic WrestleMania finish. And, even as an adult going back to watch it, I thought, well, is it as good as I remember? Yeah, to me, this is still one of the greatest WrestleMania endings to a show. So I had that slotted in at number 6. And then we get to the top 5. Number 5 on my list is WrestleMania 10. Now, this was, in many ways, I guess, the opposite of like that WrestleMania 26 match with Shawn and The Undertaker, Hogan Warrior. Those guys had good matches. Bret Hart and Yokozuna had a decent at best match with a shit finish. I enjoyed their WrestleMania 9 match more than their WrestleMania 10 match, and their WrestleMania 9 match wasn't even that good. The finish here is comically bad. Absolutely comically bad. Yokozuna didn't lose to Bret Hart. Bret Hart didn't beat Yokozuna. Yokozuna beat Yokozuna. Yokozuna had Bret Hart dead to rights. He had him in the corner for the Banzai Splash. And, I remember thinking to myself, did Piper grab the rope and shake it? When you watch, he didn't touch the ropes. Piper didn't touch the ropes. There was no assist. Yokozuna literally, as the finish was laid out here, lost his footing. He lost his balance, and he fell down. And not only did Bret Hart pin him, there was a period of probably a good 5 seconds or more before Bret even covered him. And he pinned him 1, 2, 3. This unstoppable force. Yokozuna had the championship for a long time. Nobody could stop this guy, this monster. He falls backwards and gets pinned. You couldn't have Bret, try to wrap the tree trunk legs up in the sharpshooter like he did the year before and let the guy just submit, verbally submit. Would it really have killed him? Would it have killed Yokozuna, really, to have him submit for the first time in his career? What a moment that would have been for Bret in the same building where he got Kurt Hennig to tap out in the sharpshooter, that great moment at SummerSlam in 91. Imagine them being back in Madison Square Garden, main event of WrestleMania, trying to wrench back on those big legs. If he can do it. Maybe he just felt he couldn't do it. Yokozuna submits. Because back then there were no tap outs. You had to verbally submit. And then you can have the side of Piper going and calling for the bell and everyone, the place explodes. But I guess that's asking too much. So, but of all the finishes they could have done, at least Bret won. That was the right finish, but this was shit. So I admit that freely. You might be asking yourself, boy, I'm really burying this match. Why is this on my list at number 5? Because as far as endings go, I just thought that this is, still to this day, going back and watching it, a fantastic way to end the WrestleMania show. And it's great storytelling because, A, Bret was the chosen one. The fans had made their choice. This was back when WWE was more receptive to fan feedback because their livelihood depended on it. They didn't have billion-dollar fat cat TV contracts, and they didn't have a network, and they didn't have all the things they do now, all the different ways they bring money in. They didn't have that back in 1994. In fact, business wasn't all that great in 1994. Their bread and butter was, we got to listen to the fans and what they want. And at the Royal Rumble that year, the fans made it very clear that they favored Bret Hart over Lex Luger. So poor Lex got fucked because they never put the belt on him at SummerSlam. They were going to wait until WrestleMania. Well, the best laid plans, you know what happens there. And so they went with Bret. Whatever it was, Bret was hot as hell as with the fans. He was over as anybody in that company, especially, internationally, fans in all these different countries. They'd write him fan mail and all this stuff. So they went with Bret. Bret was going to be the face of this so-called new generation, and they wanted you to know it. And he wins, and Luger comes into the ring, and Luger had been screwed earlier in the night, and he shakes hands with Bret. Piper comes back into the ring. They both raise Bret's arm. Now all the baby faces come out. Most of them who unfortunately got screwed out of being on the show because the ladder match went long with Shawn Michaels and Razor Ramon. And they supposedly got chewed out backstage about it by Macho Man, who thought it was very disrespectful of them to do that. But you had guys like Bob Holly was out there, and Tatanka and the 1-2-3 Kid. They were all supposed to be part of a 10-man tag that got bumped off the show. So I guess, maybe part of it was just throwing him a bone. They said, hey, you go out there and celebrate with Bret. So Bret's in there with Razor and Bob Holly and Tatanka. Macho Man comes back out. Burt Reynolds is in the ring. He's hugging Bret Hart. He looks happy as hell. Vince McMahon puts his headset down. He gets into the ring with Pat Patterson. They're all celebrating. They hoist Bret up on their shoulders, and everybody cheers. I sometimes forget what it's like to see these WWE crowds actually embracing the person, that's being pushed in that position. And they love Bret. They got the person they wanted, and they reacted accordingly. And then Owen Hart comes out. Now, Owen had beaten Bret earlier in the night. He pinned him 1-2-3, clean as a whistle in the middle of the ring. He didn't pull the tights. He didn't hit him with a foreign object. He didn't hold on to the ropes. He didn't kick him in the dick. He pinned him. And now he's got to sit here and watch this guy celebrate as the new champion. They zoom in on Owen's face. He mouths the words, "What about me?" He can't believe it. Macho Man is inviting him to come into the ring. Everybody's looking at Owen. They're like, come on, dude, come on in. He doesn't go in. I love that. I love that bit of storytelling there. And just the way they set things up, because you knew at that moment, Owen's got to be the number one contender. I mean, if you think about it, it was kind of ridiculous that he had to win the King of the Ring, just to get a championship match. But they had him win the King of the Ring first. He became the King of Hearts, and then eventually he got his title opportunity at SummerSlam. But just the whole celebration, having everybody in the ring hoist up Bret the way they did and just endorse him as the new guy, as the guy. And that little bit of storytelling there with Owen coming out, I love this. I love this ending so much. And, when you have it in Madison Square Garden, I mean, come on, of all the buildings to have it in. I know it's not a big stadium, but, it doesn't get more big time than that when you have that kind of finish at MSG. Old school, right? You had the little short aisleway and all that. Unfortunately, they don't have that anymore. So the Garden has lost some of its personality. But I thought that this was easily a top 5 WrestleMania finish. Number 4, WrestleMania 31. This was an excellent main event on this show. I don't care what anybody says. I think most people would probably agree with me. I don't think it's an unpopular opinion, but there are people who probably think the match, it's overrated, it wasn't that good. It was just a bunch of, suplexes and Superman punches. That first match that Roman Reigns had with Brock Lesnar, I'm pretty sure that was their very first match, still to this day is the best match that they ever had together. They've had a bunch of matches since then. None have come close, I don't think, to being as good as the match they had at WrestleMania 31. So you had this excellent main event capped off by a shocking twist. It's not very often we get a shocking twist at WrestleMania in the main event. We did it, 17, and we got one at 31. And if turning on the Shield the year before and aligning with the Authority, if that's what made Seth Rollins a headliner and a main eventer, then cashing in at WrestleMania and winning the championship in the main event made him a made man. That elevated him to the very top. And it made for one of the most memorable finishes, I think, out of all 34 WrestleMania shows. It was cool to be in the building that night when his music hit. The place went nuts once people realized what was going on. And then they had that little triple threat match for about 90 seconds there. I thought the finish was great too. Lesnar scooping him up for the F5. Roman comes out of nowhere. He was kind of off screen. He comes in, launches himself with a spear. and then Rollins hits the curb stomp and gets the pin. So it was a very brief sequence. It wasn't a long match there, but I just thought the way this all went down, from the match with Roman and Lesnar to the little triple threat they had, the shock of Rollins becoming the first person ever to cash in a WrestleMania. He wins the championship. Fans were already souring on Roman Reigns. He was already starting to get the boo bird treatment at that point. And, the people were very happy to see them not put the title on him. And, it ended up on Seth. And he got the big, celebration with the fireworks on top of the stadium. And it was a fantastic WrestleMania finish. It actually, you could argue that it's even top 2 or top 3. I have it at number 4. But you wouldn't, I wouldn't say you would be wrong if you wanted to rank it even as the greatest WrestleMania finish of all time. That's how good it was. Number 3. I debated where this would be ranked. I never debated whether or not to include it on my list. It was always going to be on the list. It was just a matter of where. But I could see some people not wanting it to be on their list because they just can't wrap their head around having a list like this with Chris Benoit on it. To me, I'm not the kind of person who can't go back and watch an old Benoit match. That has never bothered me. I may not enjoy them quite as much. I definitely look at them a little bit differently because you cannot separate. You cannot just forget about what happened after the fact. But I can still go back and watch, old Nitros and old matches that he was in and enjoy the matches for what they are. And so that to me was never really an issue. But it is very sad, to say the least, right? It's very sad to go back and you watch the end of this match, you watch the end of this show, knowing what happened, losing Eddie, and then what happened with Benoit. And Eddie, we lost Eddie the following year. It was the year after that he died, and then, of course, what Benoit would do a few years later. But if you are talking all-time great WrestleMania finishes, if you make a list, and you don't include this one, as far as I'm concerned, it is not a valid list. It just isn't. You had, first of all, the match. Let's talk about the match itself, right? Triple threat match, Chris Benoit challenging for the World Heavyweight title against Triple H and Shawn Michaels. There was a lot of drama. Fans in that building badly wanted to see Benoit win the championship. There were even moments where if he was in there with Shawn, they were booing HBK. Not a lot, but you could just tell that of the three, the people that, the person that they wanted to see walk out of there with that championship, because the story had been built up for so well for so long, was Chris Benoit. They told the story of a guy whoever thought he would be in the WrestleMania main event, one of the greatest performers of all time, never really got his just due, never really won the big one, and so here's his opportunity in the main event of WrestleMania. That was basically the story. And there's this great spot near the end. And I didn't really remember this until I went back and I watched it, but holy shit, like the blood in this match. Triple H cut himself open. Shawn Michaels cut himself open. Shawn Michaels I will say this, he did a great job too, because in the match, he quote unquote got busted open on a slingshot spot into the post. It happened so quickly. At first I was like, wait a minute, when did he cut himself? And I went back and you could tell like the moment where he did it, but it was so quick. It was so quick that it made you go, well, maybe he really did, hit his head on the post, but he was that good. But boy, he must have hit an artery or something, because it was an uncomfortable amount of blood from Shawn Michaels, and then Triple H busted himself open. And so it's a bloodbath, but there's a spot towards the end of the match where Benoit has Triple H in a sharpshooter. And they had established this on television as a move that he would sometimes use, and the people went nuts. When he put him in the sharpshooter, they thought it was the finish. They erupted. And he's got him in this hold, and they're just begging for Triple H to tap out. And then Shawn Michaels comes out of nowhere and he super kicks Benoit right out of the hold. And at that moment you think, well, that may be it for Benoit. He had the match won. Michaels gave him the super kick. That could be the end of his night. Now Shawn gets dumped out of the ring. Benoit turns around into a pedigree attempt by Triple H. That got countered into a crossface. And this is where all the drama unfolded. You had Jim Ross on the call, losing his mind, of course, as only he can. Triple H is fighting it. He actually rolls through. Benoit keeps the hold locked in, and he's starting to fade, and finally he taps out, and the fans in Madison Square Garden erupt, and they rise to their feet. This was pure wrestling drama to cap off what is still one of the greatest triple threat matches in the history of this company, and really one of the greatest matches in WrestleMania history. Jim Ross is nearly losing his voice and talking about the 18-year odyssey that Benoit was on to get to this moment, and you have all the confetti falling. You have him and Eddie Guerrero. Eddie comes out. Eddie had retained his WWE Championship against Kurt Angle earlier in the show. Now they're face-to-face in the ring. They both have their respective belts. They embrace in the middle. Confetti is falling. It was just a great moment in time. And never were two people like Chris Benoit and Eddie Guerrero supposed to headline WrestleMania as champion or win the title in the main event of WrestleMania. And these guys did. I mean, that just would have been inconceivable a few years earlier, let alone 20, years ago, 25 years ago, when the first WrestleMania took place in that very same building. So when you look at it in a vacuum, as its own moment, you wish that you could just sort of bottle it up and that everything that came after would have just never happened. But it did. And that should never be forgotten. That should never be forgiven. But I can also sit here and objectively say that this is still and will forever be, regardless of what happened after, one of the greatest WrestleMania closes of all time. Number 2 on the list is WrestleMania 30 at the Superdome in New Orleans. Another WrestleMania I was fortunate enough to be part of. Very happy that I was there. There was actually a lot of really great things on the show that night. From the opening segment, Hogan, Rock, Austin in the ring together. Cesaro body slamming Big Show out of the ring in the Battle Royal. Obviously, the streak ending is not something that I agreed with, and that certainly took the wind out of the sails of everybody in that building for the rest of the show until the closing minutes of that main event. Even part of that main event was really butchered by the crowd, because the crowd was still in shock and also disappointment and anger, I think, over what happened in the Undertaker match. The Undertaker match sucked, but the finish, it's maybe the most memorable finish in the history of the business or of WWE. I don't want to get ahead of myself and say the entire business, but it's up there. As far as WWE, it's probably number 1. If it isn't Montreal, it's this. So then you came to the main event. Now, earlier in the show, Daniel Bryan had beaten Triple H. He had to run the gauntlet. We all know the story of him going into WrestleMania. Here's another example of somebody who was never supposed to be in the main event of a WrestleMania. He caught fire, the whole yes movement, and he was never supposed to be challenging for the championship, let alone winning it at WrestleMania. He was, at best, I think he was slotted 5th or 6th from the top in a match against Sheamus. And he said so in his own book. And that is what the plan for him was up to a couple months before WrestleMania. And then CM Punk walked out. Certain things happened. And they just couldn't resist. Batista was being booed. He wasn't getting received the way they had hoped. He had just come back. And so they did the right thing in the end. They did the right thing and they changed course. And they set things up perfectly going into WrestleMania, where Bryan was the underdog. He'd have to first beat Triple H, and if he could get past him, he would earn a spot in the Randy Orton-Batista match, and it would turn into a triple threat. So Bryan and Triple H, I thought, had a great match to open the show. One of the better WrestleMania openers I think they've ever had. And they attacked him. They, injured his arm. Again, they're building drama for the main event. Will he be able to compete? Won't he be able to compete? Once the main event really got going, I'd say midway through, people really started to sort of wake up and get into it. It was great. It was like what I was talking about earlier, WrestleMania 20 in the main event, and some of the other great matches they've had, this great wrestling drama. Orton and Batista were sort of teaming up together for a while to take out Bryan. Bryan fought back, and we had the great image of him putting Batista. Anybody to tap out in this match, I would have expected it to be Orton and not Batista. And Batista had no problem. He was looking forward to putting over Daniel Bryan. And the place is going nuts. Michael Cole doing some of his best work on commentary here. Bryan taps him out. And Cole has the great line, the Miracle Kid, the Miracle Kid, the Miracle on Bourbon Street. And it was just this storybook ending that the fans demanded. The fans wanted to see it. They got what they wanted, and they got the payoff that they were hoping for. And even after what happened with Undertaker and Brock Lesnar, and as somebody who was there, I can tell you it was not easy to get these people back into this show. Because, I mean, again, it really did just sort of mute the crowd for a while. But they got them back into it, and they got the reaction they were hoping for at the end. It was perfect. It was exactly as it should be. Confetti falling, pyro going off. Bryan had both belts because you have the World Heavyweight title and the WWE belt at the time. And just a great finish to what I thought was one of the best WrestleManias in many, many years. I thought WrestleMania 30 and 31 both. Back to back. We got back-to-back excellent WrestleManias. Which is probably why we ended up with 32 and 33. You got to be careful sometimes when you get what you are hoping for. You go through this sort of low period for a while there. 32 and 33 were decidedly not as good as 30 and 31. I guess there was some good stuff on 33, right? We had the Hardys coming back. We had, what else? What else was on 33? Well, I mean, you had, talk about WrestleMania endings. Had Undertaker not come back, that would have been a hell of a way for him to go out, sort of disappearing into the darkness and leaving his gear in the ring. I considered putting that on this list too. Even though I did not like the match he had with Roman Reigns, and him coming back like nothing ever happened completely negated that finish, I still would have considered putting it in my top 10 just because, as its own standalone ending, I thought it was great. It was very sad, and it was as you would want Undertaker's final appearance to be, where he literally disappears into a plume of smoke and the lights go out. And so I thought about it, but I just I couldn't fit it in the top 10. But anyway, all of this leads to number 1. You probably have figured it out by process of elimination. There's a certain WrestleMania I haven't mentioned yet that's kind of epic. And I don't really see how you can't have this in your top 10. Maybe you don't have it at number 1. I felt like I had to put this in number 1 because there's almost this mythical, there's almost this mythical feeling about this WrestleMania show. There's been so many stories told about it. And again, whether you believe that there were 93,000 in the building that night or whether you believe that there were 78,000, there were a shitload of people in the building that night, and you see that wide shot of the crowd and everybody looks like ants just sitting around. There were a lot of people in the Pontiac Silverdome that night in 1987 for WrestleMania 3. And talk about a main event that was the shits. Just from a match perspective, like even if you're not all about work rate and that kind of thing, like just objectively looking at this as a match, it wasn't any good. Hulk Hogan against Andre the Giant was no good as a match. Andre was limited. Andre agreed to come back to put Hogan over. He had just had, I don't know if he just had back surgery or he was about to have back surgery. I think he had just recently had back surgery. So he was barely mobile. Andre couldn't move. It was painful. It still is painful to go back and watch him in this match. Hogan, bumped for him and did what he could. But there were some embarrassing moments during this match. But it doesn't matter. It wasn't about the match. It was about what came at the end of the match. Right? When he knocks down Andre and Andre takes a tumble, the place, people start to, get what's about to happen, I think. Hogan hulks up. Andre staggers to his feet. The camera pans back. All you see is just a sea of people in the Silverdome. And Hogan reaches down, he picks up the Giant over his head, and he slams Andre the Giant. And the place comes unglued. Hogan hits the ropes, hits the leg drop, gets the 1, 2, 3. Hulk Hogan retains his championship. Didn't even win it. He was already the champion. So he retained his title in the WrestleMania main event. He slayed the Giant. Now, he and Andre had wrestled before. In fact, he had body slammed Andre before. All this talk about Andre being undefeated for 15 years was bullshit. That was complete BS. Andre has never been slammed. Bullshit. Again, not true. Hogan himself had slammed him many times before. Shea Stadium. They had a match at Shea Stadium back in, was it 1980, I think it was? And he slammed Andre like it was nothing. But they did such a good job. And again, you didn't have the internet and social media back then, but they did such a good job of at least trying, I thought, to convince people that this guy had never been slammed. He was undefeated. Nobody could beat him. And it was your typical David versus Goliath story. They had been the best of friends. Andre ripped the chain from his neck. This broke Hogan's heart. Andre, what are you doing? Why are you aligned with Bobby Heenan? The way they set this match up was great. And it was, David and Hogan was just, jacked to the gills. He was a monster himself back then, but Andre still towered over him. Andre was still a giant compared to Hogan. And you had that dynamic of them face to face in the middle of the ring. And with the epic finish, and as important I think as that show is, and that show has gone on to become, it's just part of wrestling lore, WrestleMania 3. There were nobody who I've heard from who listens to the podcast, but I know there are people over the years who have popped up online who said, "Oh, I was at WrestleMania 3." And they've actually posted photos online, old photos that they took in the Pontiac Silverdome that night. And every time I come across this, it's just amazing to me because these are images I've never seen before. And you're so used to seeing the same photos and the same video from the same camera angles. When you see photos from like different perspectives of people who were actually in the building that night, it reminds you like this was just a wrestling show. People bought tickets and they went like any other wrestling show. But like if you were in the building that night, I can't imagine what that must have been like. And so the myth and the legend of this show has only grown over the years. And Hogan slamming Andre to me is the quintessential WrestleMania moment. It's the quintessential WrestleMania finish. I don't know that there's ever been a better finish than that. It's just this iconic image that can never be topped. And so I couldn't put this anywhere but number one. I thought, well, maybe it should be lower on the list because the match itself wasn't that good. And then what do I put at number one? I could do Daniel Bryan at number one, but I don't know because, again, it can't live up to that moment at WrestleMania 3. So I just felt like I had to put that at number one. I just don't know that there's been a more epic moment than that to kind of close out a WrestleMania show than WrestleMania 3. So this was fun. I like talking about this stuff, man. So hopefully you don't disagree too much with my list. If you do, let me know your list. I'll put this up on YouTube as well. So if you're listening to this on the YouTube channel, leave a comment below. Do you agree, disagree? What is your list of the top 10 WrestleMania finishes look like? What's your number one? Everybody's going to have a different answer about this. I don't want you to just tell me. I want you to explain why, like I did here. You don't have to be as wordy as I was. I have a show to do, see? So I can just talk for as long as I want. There's no time limit on this, so I just kind of wax eloquently here. But now let me know what you think. I want to get your feedback too. This was hard. To rank them was harder than I thought it would be. But ranking them is always the toughest part. But thank you to Joey for the idea. I'm glad that you pitched it, and hopefully you guys enjoyed this.